responsible franchising is governed not by the franchise agreement. I would say it's a social contract. From the franchisee's perspective, if you take my money, Mr. Franchisor, I have a realistic expectation that you're going to do everything within your power and resources to help me win more than I can win on my own. What you're looking to achieve should be achieved with a high degree of probability, or we won't sign the agreement. For me, that's nowhere to be found in the franchise agreement. So I would say the franchise agreement doesn't dictate the heart and soul of franchising any more than your marriage certificate dictates what a happy marriage looks like. We got to look past legal responsibilities and what's the moral obligation. And I think the moral obligation is what drives responsible franchising.
Representing Franchise Secrets, Erik Van Horn.
Joe, welcome back to the show, man.
Always nice seeing you.
You're a pro podcaster, pro speaker, pro author. That's what we're going to talk about today. You're not a pro pickleball player, though. We definitely know that.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah. Nor are you a pro at calling lines at pickleball. Kidding. You actually do make good line calls. For those of the podcasters, though, Erik and I play pickleball together whenever we get together.
It's the best. You wrote one of probably my favorite books in franchising, Street Smart Franchising, quite a while ago. And I still refer back to that at different times when I'm having conversations with franchisees and franchisors. Greg Nathan's going to be coming on the podcast here in a bit. I know that, you have some...
He's a good guy.
Yeah, good things to say about him. And
he might be the only guy in franchising more eccentric than me. So that ought to be a good conversation.
Well, let's jump into your new book. What's it called?
So it's put out by Wiley, and it's called The Ultimate Guide to Responsible Franchising. And the reason I wrote it, it's kind of like we talked about, is I think there's really needs to be a resurgence in ethical and responsible business practices with franchising. I think some of the emerging growth franchisors, which represent most of franchising, might be looking to make the quick buck, with a lot of the private equity coming in and some of these high exits that are starting to occur. And I think that might be creating a little bit more, I'll call it situational ethics, that we really need to remember why we all got into franchising originally and kind of get back to the roots and our core values.
So what were some of the working titles that you had to kind of give the audience a little bit of, I think that might help them understand responsible franchising? So you able to give us some of the working titles that you had as you were coming up with that book?
It's what we had was, so there was no real working title other than responsible. We added the word responsible to the ultimate book of franchising. So those were our two working titles.
So how would you define responsible franchising? Because it's a buzzword out there right now. It's good. There's some good and bad around that. It's kind of a polarizing word in some circles, which I think is good. I mean, I think it brings it up what's behind it and what motivated you. So you started to say some of these high dollar transactions that young emerging brands are going through. What are some of the, give us some of the audience, most of the audience has no idea what that even means. They might be thinking $1 million or 10 million. Can you give some context to high value, high dollar transactions?
Yes, I would say that the established private equity firms that are actively seeking franchisor transactions are looking for companies at about 2 million in EBITDA on up. And then the multipliers are usually 10 would be a low multiplier, but so 20 million to hundreds of millions of dollars worth of exits, but 20 million would be probably the lowest exit you would see.
What would some of the higher exits company be on a $2 million?
Billions. Yeah.
What?
Oh, at a $2 million EBITDA, I would 11 to 13 times earnings probably. So yeah, I've seen companies get 15. So 20 to 30 million. And usually those transactions are to companies looking to sell to other private equity firms downstream. And then the ownership usually leaves, 20%, 30% into the next deal. And the next exit might be 100 million, 150 million, 200 million.
So explain that. They sell to a company that wants to sell it again.
Right.
Like the franchisees, they wonder about this, Joe, because we got franchisors that are thinking about getting into that are in franchising. We have these conversations all the time at Front Street with brands, but like, what's the progression?
Right.
So a brand sells, like, and they sell, and it depends who they sell to and what that brand might, like that brand identity, how that brand might fare over the next 3 to 5 to 10 years. So like when you say maybe it's a quicker transaction, somebody's buying it for a quick flip. Is that what you're kind of saying?
I don't know. A quick flip might be 4 to 7 years, right? So is that a quick flip? I don't know. Pliables is one of our clients. The founder sold private equity. They held it 3 years and they just exited to Sycamore. It's another, which is a large equity firm that specializes in specialty retail, right? So that happens, at 100 million plus, it's an equity firm selling to another private equity firm. But at 20 million, 25 million, it's often a founder transaction.
Give me some ideas of responsible, like what's responsible franchising, what's irresponsible franchising?
So let's just start high level. So just definitions. So I would even start with what's responsible franchising would start for me with why does a franchisor exist, right? So I would say in FPG, when we espouse that a franchisor exists, for the sole reason of adding value to a franchisee's investment. So more value, in equity and cash flow than it's extracting in initial fees and royalties. So that's, I think, responsible. So the franchisor, we would say, is under a social obligation, not necessarily a legal obligation, but I'll call it a social contract to add more value to the franchisee than they're extracting in continuing fees. And then we would say along the same lines of ethical and responsible franchising, a franchisee would exist to add more value, real and perceived value to the customer than it's extracting in price. So we call that the value chain, right? And as long as everybody is committed to the value chain, that brand will grow. Because it's one of those things where responsible franchisors, responsible franchisees put more into the brand than they take out. But by doing that, at the end of the day, they take out more than they put in. It's just one of the wonderful, interesting paradoxes, I think, that you see in franchising. So I would start that as a definition, right? And if you believe that's a definition, then what's the brand, right? Who owns it? So I would say irresponsible franchising would be the franchisor's story, would be my brand, my system, my customer, my advertising, my marketing, my, right? And if that's the case, then what's a franchisee? That's the sharecropper model, right? The franchisee, most franchisors, if they take up the royalties 6 or 8%, that's $1 of royalty for every $2 or $3 in EBITDA, right? That makes them a partner as far as I'm concerned, not because they take it off the top, right? But as a percentage of royalties as it relates to EBITDA contribution, it's a third often in most chains. So if that's the case and they're my partner, well, they better be doing something, right? For that money. It's not rent, right? And I think irresponsible franchising would look at the royalty as rent. I think responsible franchisors look at it as fees for services, right? And just like the franchisee has to add more value, is under a social obligation, and it's good business practice, right? They got to add more value to have a sustainable business, then they're extracting in price from their customers. I would say it's the same thing with the franchisor. You got to add more in real and perceived value to that royalty stream than you're taking out in dollars. And as long as that's your commitment and you're good at it and you're doing it, the chain will operate under its own momentum. There's a flywheel effect.
Attention, franchisors and franchisees. There are two really important resources that I want to share with you that will help you avoid costly mistakes and increase your enterprise value. The first is our free Facebook group. It's a community that has over 4,000 franchisees and franchisors in it. When somebody asks a question, they get honest and authentic answers from multiple perspectives. You can join the group for free over at franchisesecrets.com/Facebook. The second resource I want to share with you is if you're a franchisee and you want to be around a community of successful Zs and other brands and in other industries, this is why I created the Franchisee Mastermind. If you want access to the best single and multi-unit owners to know what they're doing, or if you want to be around other multi-brand owners, then you'll want to check out my Franchisee Mastermind. The reason why people join is they want access to my Rolodex, my connections, to each other. They want a shortcut success, both short-term and long-term. Links will be in the show notes or at scalablefranchise.com. Let's talk about fees in that value chain. So franchisors can charge different fees. They can charge a higher franchise fee. Some franchisors think it's great to charge a $20,000 franchise fee because they think they are helping the franchisees out by charging a lower fee. Others are like, market's $50,000, even though we have 0 franchisees or maybe 10 franchisees, they're starting out at that $50,000 mark, but they have the mindset like those franchisees are going to get an ROI on that 50. They also charge training fees. They also charge marketing fees. They also charge just different fees. So is this more value related versus fee? Because there could be a franchisor that charges a lot less in fees, but that's not giving a lot of value. There could be a franchisor, same industry, same concept, that's charging a lot more in fees, called twice the amount of fees altogether between flat fees of like franchise fee and royalties, but they're giving 3 times the amount of value. So how does that play into the value creation when you look at it?
Well, for me, it's value add, but I would say the franchisor doesn't get to say what the kind of value they're adding any more than the franchisee gets to tell the customer how satisfied they are, right? So for me, it would be real and perceived value, right? So real value, some of it's going to be measured, right? And then some of it is more perceived. Like, what's the value of a really good training program so a franchisee can onboard employees and mitigate the risk of turnover, right? You may not always be able to measure that in real dollars, but it's got value, right? But at the end of the day, the real and perceived value should exceed or at least equal to the fees that the franchisor is charging. So I'm not hung up at all on the initial franchise fee, and I'm not hung up at all on the royalties, as long as franchisees, which is their constituency, are making the kind of money they need to make to consider it a good investment.
Let's go down a little rabbit hole and then pull me back. So, rebates.
I would expect nothing less of you and I.
Rebates. Franchisors getting rebates from vendors. There's from a supplier or, something like that.
Yes.
Talk to us about rebates. What do you think is responsible? What do you think is irresponsible? Or maybe just educate them on rebates a little bit. Go where you want.
Okay. So rebates is how much money franchisors make on franchisees' purchases, right? I mean, that's what we're talking about. I've got no issues with rebates. I've got issues with transparency, right? So it's a royalty, right? That's what it is. Okay. So it needs to be, in my world, it needs to be disclosed. So I would say franchisees should know exactly, what those rebates are back to the franchisor. Otherwise, it's a hidden royalty. And I would say any hidden royalty would be kind of going under, that would create trust issues with me. And
So
I don't
talk
think
about
there
transparency
really
now.
needs to be.
Let's say
Well, so what is it? Yeah, there's a dollar amount that goes back to the franchisor from vendors. What is it? And then where's that money going? Is
what
it
do you
going
mean
back
by,
to the franchisees and fees or services?
what do you mean, where's it going? Like so what's legal for a franchisor to talk about? What is like going above and beyond for the franchisor to disclose?
Well, I think it's all legal, right? You don't have to disclose anything. We're not really in a conversation about what's legal or illegal. It's just what's, I'll call it ethical and responsible, and I'll say irresponsible and potentially unethical. So as it relates to rebates, Eric, I would say it's not really a disclosure issue because they're legal. You can do it. So for me, it's about a transparency issue, and what will build trust and what destroys trust in the brand. So if you're going to have a rebate, okay, essentially that's a royalty, and franchisors should treat it as such. So I would be into full disclosure of what is the rebate, how much is going back to the franchisor, and what's that money used for. So some franchisors will earmark it, okay, as money that goes back into the franchisee community in the way of advertising or products and services. Some franchisors will just use it as a slush fund for leadership, and then don't disclose what that amount is, right? It might show up on the P&L, but franchisee would have to dig to find out what that number is. And the rebates are always at the expense of the franchisee, because if there were no rebate, franchisees would get their products and services cheaper from suppliers, predictably.
Let's talk about that a little bit, because that, I think that's one of the overarching things. Franchisors, I like it when franchisors are giving the product to the franchisees, or having relationships that is at market or even below market what they could get that product for themselves out on the open market. Franchisors, I'm fine with them having rebates, if I'm getting that at a discount, because they're buying stuff in bulk most of the time, or they have things set up so they're getting rebates on that, but it does not hurt the franchisee. That's what rebates that hurt franchisees, I don't like that. I don't like that at all. Is that kind of your philosophy around that?
If they're taking a rebate, and I'll give you a caveat, then that rebate could have gone to the franchisees to reduce their product or services. So even they could be getting product and services cheaper than they could buy on their own. But if there's a rebate, then they're generally not getting the best deal they could have gotten if there was no rebate, because somebody's paying for that, right? It's going to be the franchisees. So now, however, there are times for franchisors are taking possession, right, of the merchandise or the products or services in order to pass a discount along. Well, in that scenario, take a rebate, right? Because somehow you got to pay, okay, for the holding costs and the inventory costs of that product or service. So in that scenario, I would say that's being very responsible and being a great franchise partner. And I would reward that if I was a franchisee, okay, with making that at least a small profit center, because the franchisor is diverting resources towards it.
So do you think if, let's say, a franchisor negotiates something that's on the market for $1 and they negotiate it at 50 cents because they're buying in bulk, they never touch the product or warehouse the product, but they sell it, the franchisee pays 75 cents to that manufacturer for it. So the franchisee is getting 25% off because they're with the franchisor. Franchisor's collecting 25% on that. I'm just using, obviously, probably not realistic numbers, but is that responsible or irresponsible? And let's say it's not, the exact amount are not disclosed.
So I would say if it's disclosed and we're transparent, it's responsible. It's like anything. If somebody will pay it, then and they're happy, then that's fine, right? It's a fair exchange because there's full disclosure. I would say where there's not disclosure, then that creates mischief.
Okay, good. No, I think, and I'm putting you on the spot on a lot of this stuff too, because this stuff doesn't get talked about very often in public forums. I don't think. Do you see this talked about quite often in a public forum like this?
Not rebates as much as it could be. You see a lot of Coca-Cola try to figure out their rebate. I don't know if you've ever seen that in food service. It's like, it's this crazy mess algorithm. Who knows, right? But so there's even systems for making it so mucky that even franchisees can't even distinguish what they're getting and why, and what the franchisors are getting and why.
The overarching theme that I hear from you is be more transparent versus less transparent, and
Across the board. Yeah.
across the board, and don't, like, if there's some savings, pass some of that along to the franchisees. All of it is like probably, amazing, but pass some of that along to the franchisees and disclose and be transparent as much as possible. That would point the arrow to more responsible franchising, right? Is that kind of the overarching?
Yeah, that would be an example of that. Yes, I think it's responsible franchising would be try to set up a scenario where franchisees are getting their products cheaper than if they did it in the marketplace. So you go back to Quiznos, right, where the franchisor charged a 25% premium, and they could get the products and services cheaper at the local supermarket. And because they couldn't make money, they were forced to do that. Okay, because the food cost was so not competitive, and then they were suing their franchisees for doing it because of the lost royalty stream. Like, so that whole debacle would be probably one of the biggest examples of irresponsible franchising. Another would be Subway. Funny, we're in the subcategory, but so Subway's 8% royalty. It's fine. They kept their front end down, so they had the highest royalty. But actually putting stores that they know are too close together that eat into franchisees' profitability. If you got two sub shops that are each doing $1 million, or shops out doing $1 million, and then one goes next to it, now they're both doing 750. That's that franchisee lost probably 40% of that incremental decrease in sales, or $100,000, but the franchisor increased its royalty revenue, right? So that becomes a win-lose. And Subway had gotten that reputation to be a win-lose kind of franchisor by putting them too close together, and they were okay with it, right? And franchisees couldn't do anything because that's what the agreement said. So you talk back to we talked about the philosophy of responsible franchising, right? So I think responsible franchising is governed not by the franchise agreement. I would say it's a social contract. And the social contract for me states, okay, if from the franchisor and the franchisee, if from the franchisee's perspective, if you take my money, Mr. Franchisor, I have a realistic expectation that you're going to do everything within your power and resources, okay, to help me win more than I can win on my own. Like there's a stewardship or a shift. The franchisor is really taking on the responsibility of invested capital, time, money, and energy, and quite frankly, the dreams and the goals of the franchisee, right? So the promise is really, if we do business together, okay, what you're looking to achieve should be achieved with a high degree of probability, or we won't sign the agreement. Okay, for me, that's nowhere to be found in the franchise agreement. So I would say the franchise agreement doesn't dictate, okay, the heart and soul of franchising any more than, Erik, your marriage certificate dictates, what a happy marriage looks like. We got to look past legal responsibilities and what's the moral obligation. And I think the moral obligation is what drives responsible franchising.
Let's get off of the rabbit trail that I drug us down and talk about how many franchisors are responsible franchisors. Like, what would you say? Is that, are
that's
we talking
a great question. I mean, I don't really...
An 80-20? Is it like an 80-20 rule that you think? Because it's not a contractual thing. It's like who's doing the right thing out there. And there's a spectrum out there. It's not like it's a checklist.
Yeah.
So how would you answer that?
I have no way of measuring that, but that's an interesting question. I would start at 50-50 as a working assumption. And kind of maybe I'm a little glib on that, and maybe people would say it's more 80-20 towards responsible. I'm not sure. I could tell you, I've been doing this 40 years now. I'm going into my 40th year. I can give you the trajectory because I would say the trajectory is going in the wrong way. I would say we were right sizing it probably 5, 10 years ago. Now I'm hearing things being taught as best practice, like, yeah, pump and dump as far as franchise sales, right? We had gotten away from, I think, that philosophy 10 years ago, and we were materially towards, franchisee recruitment as matching entrepreneur to opportunity. It was more of a talent acquisition function. It was, it required more executive recruiting type techniques. We are back to hardcore sales. So that would be kind of, for me, an example of, a dramatic movement to irresponsible franchising, right? So I will tell you, if we go down that rabbit trail, because I think that that's where it's very visible, most visible, would be in franchise development. That could tell you right up front how you staff your company would tell me whether you're responsible or irresponsible. You got a salesperson in there, like pure sales, right? Where they look at the franchise as a transaction, right? And its feature benefit close. Or do you have somebody in there that's actually evaluating the candidate against their probability of success, right? About what kind of value they're going to be adding to the brand. And is this brand a fit from the candidate's perspective? And at the end of the day, a business, any business, you're self-employed, I'm self-employed, it exists for the benefit of the owner, right? So, we have to evaluate candidates even from the franchise candidate's perspective. Is this business going to deliver their objectives with the highest degree of probability? I will tell you, we mystery shop franchise salespeople regularly. And I will tell you, in 20 years of doing it, maybe 200 franchise salespeople, never one time, not one time, were we effectively interviewed. Put it another way, if I was a secretary going for a job with a franchisor, I would have a more thorough screening process than what we would go through in our mystery shop with the franchise candidate. Other than the only questions we're asked is those self-serving pre-qualification franchisor questions. How much money do you have? What's your time frame? What area are you looking to do business in to see if they have that territory available? Other than that, nothing.
What are better questions to ask? What are better questions that a candidate, a buyer, should be hoping to hear from a franchisor that is interviewing them a little bit more?
One of the first things we do, because we have an FSO, a franchise sales organization, and we have a standard 13 questions that we ask everybody plus expanders. So one of the questions we ask, because we match people to opportunity, what are your greatest skills? Another would be, what do you really like to do in business? Because people will gravitate towards that. What don't you like to do? If we were to do business together, where do you already know you'll need more training and development? In other words, where's your exposure, right? Because we're helping them evaluate risk. What are you looking to achieve, and what's your window of achieving that? Now, the easiest thing to quantify is the money part, but even make them think through the non-monetary quality of life type things, right? So somebody says, yeah, look, I've got little kids. I want to spend more time at home, but I want to make 250 grand a year. That's great. Maybe the business can generate 250 grand, but if they got to work 80 hours a week to do it, then it's not a fit, right? So it's really listening through the prism of what the franchisee wants, right? And evaluating against what the business is. I would say another irresponsible thing is when you accentuate the positive of business and you try to hold back what you would see as the negatives or to start to eliminate objections. I think what's more responsible is, let me tell you exactly what the business is. Let me tell you what it isn't. We'll even talk about, where people trip up. So we recruit franchisees for Sandler sales. It's a great model. It's been around over 50 years. The franchisees are legacy. They're doing great. They keep re-upping in their agreements. Top 50 as it relates to franchisee-franchisor relationships. So we talked to a candidate. Most of these guys are very senior sales managers. Well, that's been 20 years since they carried a bag, right? Gone out, pounded on doors, gone in, done cold calls, do networking events. Well, that throws the senior guys. So we have that conversation. Let me tell you what where if you're going to fall down anywhere, where you will fall down, it's in the first 1 or 2 years. You're going to spend an exorbitant amount of time outside your office, going to networking events, glad handing, and generating leads on your own through networking. What will that be like for you? Yeah, and have that conversation. There's no reason not to be fully transparent. And some people will say, well, you'll close less deals. Not in my experience. You close more when you're more transparent because people will want to do business with you.
I can't say I disagree with any of that. Those are all valid questions that should be asked, and kind of the frame that a franchisor should have, or the FSO should have, when they're talking to candidates. I mean, that's why we created Front Street Equity Partners, and our FSO division is aligned with that brand. And we like to talk about the negatives of the business. I think franchisors don't want to do that right away because they are so hungry for franchisees until they have a franchisee or 2 or 3 or 10 that are complaining about the hard things in the business that they didn't really fully understand. It might be licensing, it might be labor, it might be marketing, it might be the types of people that you have to hire, it might be the challenge of real estate, whatever those challenges are, because all businesses have these challenges. But that should, we highlight that stuff because you want, and I know other groups, friends of mine that are in franchising on the franchisor side do the same thing. I have these conversations with them. They want the candidates to understand the difficult things about the business and why it's not easy. Because if everything looks easy, if it looks like it's an absentee franchise, which by the way, I don't believe that there are any absentee franchises out there.
Yeah, I don't get it, right?
Maybe at some point, but it's hard enough to find I just don't see that. And I'm vocal about that. Semi-absentee, that's true out there, but there's a lot of questions that franchisees of a semi-absentee brand need to ask to fully understand what it looks like to be semi-absentee from a time commitment, and what does that look like when you're ramping up versus 2 or 5 years down the road? What if it's out of state? There's all kinds of other questions to ask about a semi-absentee owner. What kind of manager should I really be hiring? Am I prepared to hire that kind of manager? So I agree with everything that you're saying. And I do see that as a weakness out there in the marketplace, whether it's FSOs or salespeople or founders or whatever. So I 100% agree. And I think franchisors, if you're listening to this, you do want to be transparent about the challenges of your business, because I promise you, your franchisees, if that's glossed over, not really talked about during the sales process, which people don't like calling it a sales process, but if you're selling that new franchisee versus interviewing them and educating them on the good things and the bad things about the brand, you're going to end up with challenging franchisees. And I would rather not have a challenging franchisee that's making me some money versus waiting for a franchisee that will help that brand make money later on and be a pleasure to work with.
Make an interesting point. And now, why is that important? Think about who a franchisor makes most money off of, right? It's the peak performing franchisees. And then you say, well, who actually occupies more of the franchisor's time and resources? It's the struggling franchisees, right? So it's a complete value inversion, right? So I could argue that the struggling franchisees get the best value for the royalty stream, and successful franchisees get the worst value. And it should be the other way around, right? Or mitigate your risk by not bringing in. I will also tell you, I started my business doing franchise sales training. And, during my sessions, I'd always ask the room, think about a franchisee that the chain or you brought on that wasn't successful. And I'd say, wait, when you got that person, raise your hand. I'd wait till every hand was raised. And then I would say, what did you step over in the interview process? Okay. Or ignore that would have told you they would have not succeeded. And never have I ever heard, I didn't step over anything. It was always, I was willfully ignorant, or I blinded myself to whatever they blinded themselves to. And then you're saying, well, why? It's why would you willfully blind yourself to what's obviously there? And then it's the deal flow, it's the commission, it's the number, it's the pressure, for the quarterly target. It's all the things that we talk about. But you know what? It's not. Will this franchisee be successful?
Let's talk about franchisors. I think one of the best things a franchisor can do, / how they can be a responsible franchisor, is focusing on the franchisee's profitability. Like, how can I help franchisees be more profitable? So where does that fall into the spectrum of responsible franchising?
I would say that's why a franchisor exists. Right? It's a core in the DNA of responsible franchising. Yeah.
What are some of the best practices that you've seen? Let's help some franchisors, Joe. I mean, we advise franchisors all the time. You do the same. How do you advise franchisors to have that mindset of like focusing on franchisee profitability? And what are some of the best franchisors doing out there to help franchisees be profitable?
Well, let's take it from end to end. I'm going to just go into a riff, if that's okay, Eric, right?
Go for it.
So I would say, let's start. So the definition of franchising, we would say, is recruiting, training, and developing, leading, and resourcing a team of entrepreneurs to build a brand, right? So recruiting. Well, recruiting for me would be knowing who you're looking for and who's successful in your brand, knowing who's a culture fit, knowing what the relevant experience and the transferable skills are. And then you design an interview process to make sure that's who you're sitting with. And, not everybody's going to be perfect, and not every candidate's going to be a perfect overlay to the profile of the successful franchisee. But where there's risk factors, then you openly discuss them. I remember recruiting for a business service franchisor. I would say, you don't have enough sales experience, and I'm not sure you'll even like sales. So I used to send them the sailor to take a sales course and then get back to me with what you think. Let's put it on hold first. The course was 4 months. We'll put this on hold for 4 months, and I'm going to check back in with you 4 months. And then you tell me whether or not you think they'll be a fit. I think that is high integrity. So let's call that recruiting, right? So just bringing on people that resemble the profile of a successful franchisee, and don't assume one size fits all. Like I have a brother who's an actuary and his wife's an actuary. I would suck as an actuary, like epically bad. But that's no indictment of the actuarial field, because they're good at it and they have a good living, right? Now we recruited them. Next obligation, training. So what's training, right? So a lot of franchisors, it's a 1 or 2 week data dump. Then they kick them out the door and they go say, have at it, right? Yeah, like that's how adults learn, right? So if you did a good job recruiting, here's a little nugget for you. Hopefully you recruited somebody who's so competent, they forgot what it's like to be trained. They don't even remember. They don't even know how to learn anymore, right? So how do you train somebody who doesn't even know how to be trained? I would say every franchisor has the obligation of being an adult education expert, right? So, it starts with imparting knowledge and skills. I see a lot of franchisors, I'm going to say irresponsible franchisors, it's a data dump, right? And I'm going to say, knowledge really doesn't make a difference. I got some knowledge for the overweight people in the world, which is 67% of Americans, right? It's diet and exercise. Eat less, move more. Does that make a difference? No, because obesity is going in the wrong direction. It's just that's not what adults do, right? So with franchisors, we've got to be behavior change experts, and we got to be adult education experts. So that's training people to be good at what they do on a competency level. But if you read the book, I like the book Outliers, and it talks about the 10,000 hour rule. If you want to be an expert in something, it takes 5 years of doing it. Competency, I would say most brands that I've been attached to is 3 years. So I don't see a lot of franchisors with a 3-year training program where there's monitor results and observed behaviors out in the field to make sure that franchisee actually has what it takes to win, right? So, I might see it for a training event of 2 weeks. Sometimes I'll see it for 6 months. seldom do I see a critical path to competency level when they're legitimately skilled and can design positive outcomes, right? So that's the training piece. Resourcing. Okay, so what products and services am I getting to them and at what cost to create a competitive advantage? I'd say a lot of franchisors are pretty good on supply lines because they're cutting their own throat if they're not. I think it's probably enlightened self-interest. And then profitability coaching. How many franchisors pick up P&Ls and go line by line, at least through the controllables, with franchisees, spot opportunity and put them on a plan to capture lost opportunity? I don't see a lot of that. I see a lot of call me if you need me. A lot of franchisors don't even have standard charts of accounts. So they can't even compare what franchisees are doing in all the controllable areas. They just assume franchisees going to do all these outrageous or inconsistent write-offs against the business, and therefore the P&L is meaningless, right? But as long as they get their top line, well, top line doesn't solve every problem, right? They all look at the top line because that's who butters their bread, right? They get it off the top.
How often do you see franchisors going over franchisees' P&Ls with them?
I would say probably less than 30%, if I had to guess.
What do you think best practices for franchisors? They're like, hey, I want to be at the top. I want to be in the top 10, top 30%. And I'm not doing anything with my franchisees' P&Ls. I really don't know if they're profitable or not. I'm just assuming they are based off of their top line. How would you advise that franchisor to help their franchisees with
P&L? So
P&L?
I think for me it would be would tell you every 6 months would be because then you can impact it for the next 6 and they don't lose the year, right? So, quarterly, if you can do it, maybe that's something as simple as benchmarking, but there's profitability and then there's also operational and expansion readiness, right? So if they're profitable and they're making good cash flow, okay, how can I use that to my advantage as a franchisor and help this franchisee expand? Because every time I take a new franchisee in, that's brand risk. But if I've got somebody I've got a track record with and I could get them to take on another territory, it will probably get a higher valuation in the world of private equity. So it's good business sense. And then it's less brand risk.
Yep.
And easy, and that next territory is easier to support. So the franchisor margins are even better. Yeah. On the royalties. Because you kind of support the franchisee more than you support the unit or territory, right? I mean, you're a franchisor.
For sure.
Yeah.
What's the best way for a franchisor to help with KPIs and monitor those KPIs? 'Cause it's one thing just kind of look at them, or not. Some franchisors even have them set up, but like, what are some best practices? What are the best franchisors doing out there around KPIs and helping their franchisees make decisions off of them?
Well, I think they know what the KPIs are that drive all the business, right? So, take food service. It's going to be food cost and labor cost. And those are the really two major controllables. Everything else is kind of standard, right? And so you monitor those, very, very closely. So it's knowing what KPIs make a difference and making it a manageable number. And then second, it would be the strategy pieces, right? How do you help a franchisee strategize and create an operating plan to hit those numbers, right? And then there's the follow-up and follow-through. Did they or did they not hit the numbers? If not, why not? And what could we do differently over the next period, right? So I think kind of an intense numbers focus, measuring the right things, understanding what is and what isn't acceptable, right? So there's ranges a lot of times in KPIs of ranges of acceptability. And then what are the common contributing factors, okay, for if somebody's missing, right? And then what could they be doing differently to hit it next time and capture lost opportunity? I see that as kind of a continual cycle.
Hey, before I forget, we'll do it here in a bit as well, but how do people find the book? How do they get the book?
Amazon and in bookstores, if there's any bookstores left. Yeah, so
I don't know.
so it's the ultimate guide. It actually should be in airports now.
Really?
It's an audio version. There's electronic version for Kindle. There's an audio book, and then there's a hardcover textbook.
So who should be reading this book?
I would say franchisor executives and then franchise candidates who are looking to do business with an ethical and responsible franchisor that's committed to adding value.
So let's go straight to franchisee validation, because you just talked about franchise candidates getting the book. What are some of your favorite questions, or maybe most underutilized questions, that a candidate should be asking franchisors or other franchisees? Excuse me.
That's a great question. I used to call this the golden question. Knowing what you know now, would you make the same decision again? Yes or no? Yeah, and Greg Nathan, if you ask him, when you said you're going to talk to Greg Nathan, my data showed if 80% of franchisees don't say emphatically yes, it's a turnaround brand. Whether it objectively looks like a turnaround brand in the numbers, it's a turnaround brand. The numbers will make it a turnaround brand soon enough. Nathan measured that actually, and he would say 76 or 77% in the conversation I had with him.
Wow.
So mine was more anecdotal at 80%, but that would be for me the cut to the chase question, right? So if I could only limit myself to one question, it would be that.
Yeah, that's good. What else? What else have we not hit on before we wind things down? What am I not asking that I should be asking right now, Joe?
That's another great question we ask franchisees to ask other franchisees. Yes, yes. So we touched on recruitment. We touched on private equity. That's good. Operations. Leadership. Let's just talk about culture and leadership. Yeah, that's I think one we might have skipped over. So I would say there's some prevailing corporate cultures in franchising. Some responsible, some irresponsible. So the most responsible corporate culture that I would like every franchisor to adopt is more of a servant leadership model. Okay, so some of the leading proponents in that, Robert Greenleaf, I think, started that model in the 60s. There's a lot of good content out there. And then Ken Blanchard from 1 Minute Manager and Rick Warren from Purpose Driven Life picked it up. Okay, and then created a lot of content around servant leadership. So servant leadership basically says, I exist to remove your obstacles of growth. So a franchisor would exist, to identify and remove any organizational obstacles a franchisee would have and resource the right things so they could propel, right? So it's not looking at the franchisee and saying, well, my leader, I'm going to dangle the carrot, and when that doesn't work, I'll use a stick. The servant leadership model says, I'm going to recruit thoroughbreds, and I'm just going to open the pen and I'm going to let them go, because that's what thoroughbreds were designed to do, get out and run, right? So that's the servant leadership model. What we see, I think more than that, would be command and control, right? So with a heavier authority at the top, pushing rules, regulations down. And I think the worst version of command and control would be a compliance culture, where, when you actually do go into a unit, talk to franchisees, it's not about whether or not they're profitable, it's whether or not they're in compliance. So it'd be kind of like, very bureaucratic type operations. The other culture I see, I'm going to call it irresponsible, but less irresponsible than command and control and certainly bureaucracies, would be the benevolent dictatorships. You see that a lot with founder-led companies where, family is, my daughter just made VP of marketing. Well, okay, does she have the credentials, right? Or pool people who shoot pool with the owner, throw some back, or go to Buffalo Wild Wings and watch the football games on a weekend. Where they just create a little fiefdom around with the kind of the benevolent dictator making all the decisions. I used to work with a company, multi-brand franchisor, benevolent dictator in Houston, Texas, and the guy's name was Bud. And the joke was they don't have budgets, they only have Bud gets, because whatever Bud wants, Bud gets. I always thought that was pretty funny.
I've seen that as well. What when an early brand founder is ready to give up, they need leadership. A founder cannot do it all anymore. They have franchisees, they have, too much responsibility, and the brand needs some leadership beyond the founder. Is it more important for that person to have industry experience or franchising experience if you had to choose one?
So I want to make sure I understand the question. I'm a founder. I can no longer make it on force of will and force of personality, right? Now it's got to be about processes, people, and systems, right?
Yep.
You probably need the domain area expertise, and hopefully the organization wasn't stretched so thin that people with the domain area experience have started quitting, because that happens, right? When you're an emerging growth franchisor and the founder's starting breaking, it's that institutional knowledge is what kind of gets you through the next wave, right?
So you mean
if there's
institutional
turnover
from the industry or from the franchising, knowing how to work with
yeah,
franchise
within the
work?
consumer facing or B2B model, yeah. So
I
coming
might
right out of that model.
I might push
So
back on
if you're
that.
losing that, you
Franchise-
got to replace it.
I think franchising might be more important because then this is why.
Yeah.
And I don't know that there's a right answer. So that's why this is good.
I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm saying if there's turnover in the organization, you're going to need both.
I think the argument to bring on somebody with franchising experience is because you have franchisees that they're dealing with. And like, I think you probably say it all the time too. Like, you are not in the industry experience business anymore. You're not in the whatever the
That's
roofing, the fencing, the fitness business anymore. You're in the franchising business now. And now you have franchisees that need help. And I think that you need somebody that knows how to work with franchisees and help them become more successful.
Absolutely. But I'm just saying that that's not generally how it plays out in the real world. So what I usually see is if it's an emerging, because I think your example was an emerging growth founder-led company, right?
Yep.
So a lot of people, when it's emerging growth moving into regional or national brand, a lot of employees are pulling double duty.
Yeah.
They've got 2 jobs, they got 3 jobs, right? And they get spread thin. So if they're going to get poached from other larger organizations,
Sure,
calling on them, offering them. So you see that. And that's often what happens when the founder often says, look, I'm in over my head. My people are getting poached. Everybody's getting pulled too thin, or they're quitting, right? Because they're no longer happy because they're just working too hard, or they're too frantic, or we're always in a firefight. It's just an unhappy work environment. Assuming that's not occurring, Erik, I'd be 100% agree with you. Get the franchise professionals that know how to build a franchise brand, because the domain area expertise and the consumer-facing model exists.
Yeah.
Okay, if there's turnover, you're going to need both. You're going to need to bring on people that understand franchising because you're in the business of franchising. But if there's holes now or gaps in the institutional knowledge of that product or what it is to deliver that product or service, those need to be plugged too. So
100%.
Yes, you're right, 100% right. You need the franchise experience, and then you may need to plug in other gaps too.
Well, who do you think has a higher duper score, you or me?
Good question. Mine went down. I signed up to a 4-0 tournament. I got slammed. So mine went from 4-1 or 4-2 to 3-9 something, and then I haven't played anything yet.
No, man, it's going down. Mine's
How about you? Where are you at?
I'm like 4-2. So we'll play together in Vegas, and then we'll see the real answer to that.
I can't wait. I would rate myself at about a 4.25, but my duper score doesn't reflect that.
All right. Well, we'll be playing in Florida for fun. Anybody that's out there that does play pickleball, if Joe and I, when we go to these industry conferences, franchisor stuff, hit us up. We'll play with you as long as you're a 3.5 or better, says Joe.
Because we're snobs.
Yeah, exactly. But go get his book, Responsible Franchising. And Joe, I appreciate your friendship. What you do for the franchising world. Pleasure to have you on. I'm so glad we've gotten to know each other over the years. So thanks a bunch for coming on, man.
Good conversation, Erik. Thanks, bud.
Thanks for listening to the Franchise Secrets podcast. Links to everything can be found over at franchisesecrets.com. And if you want my help with anything from starting your own franchise to growing your current franchise business, please visit scalablefranchise.com.